Welcome back to Wagons of Steel. It's a party and everyone's still invited. So in my last video, I got a request in the comments to explain how to build a stalker and why it's so hard to get heads for my 1964 Plymouth. And I'll start with the 64 Plymouth heads first and keep this brief because it is slightly boring. My 64 Plymouth is what's called a max wedge. It's got a max wedge engine in it, and max wedge engines were the top of the line performance engine from 1962 to the midway through 1964 from Mopar before they were replaced by the mighty Hemi. And they changed slightly every year, 62, 63, and 64. And the 64 is the most exotic of them because in midway through they changed over to the Hemi for their maximum performance engine, and they just stopped making the max wedge. So there's only half a year worth of those made originally. Now, just to continue down the rabbit hole of max wedge engine knowledge, more than you ever knew you wanted, they reproduced the 1964 and 1963 heads, which are very, very similar. And they did that a couple of times. So there's basically 3 different generations of max wedge heads. The first one they did was, I don't really know what the timing was. I think it was in the 80s or the early 90s. And Mopar did kind of a crappy job. They didn't, with all the resources they had, they could have made a really nice set of reproduction max wedge heads. And since you're not allowed to mess with the heads, you can't port them, polish them, cut them down, put epoxy in them, any of the performance tricks that people do on cylinder heads, you cannot do to a head in Stock Eliminator. More on that later when I talk a little bit more about how to build a stalker. But so they did kind of a crappy job, and the max wedge people weren't happy with that. So basically what that means is that the racers were still after the original max wedge heads, which, guess what, all the people who restore original max wedge style cars for car shows and stuff, they're still after them too. So they kind of put them, the restorers and the racers, in competition with each other. And with racing, use is abuse, and eventually all the heat cycles and putting intake manifolds on and off and blowing up motors and all that stuff, it takes a toll. So eventually the heads are no good for anybody if you race them. So Mopar again made a run of max wedge heads. Again, I don't have the exact timing of this, so I could be wrong, but not far off, in the 2000s. And this was a better version, but for whatever reason, they didn't make that many of them. They didn't make as many as they said they would, and I've never been able to find a set of the second generation ones. I mean, I've heard about them, but then I've never really followed through. Because the long and the short of it is, the max wedge heads, they're a legend and everything, but they're pretty obsolete. Like if you're building a high performance race car for anything but stock max wedge, you would never pick a max wedge head to put on your race car. It's not. I mean, it was top of the line in 1964, but it's not top of the line in 2020. That's for sure. And so there's just not that many of them out there. So when I broke a head by letting it sit in my trailer without heat on one winter, it cracked. I put out the word that I was looking for some heads, and I really didn't have any luck. And so I had to repair the ones I had, the one that I broke. And that involves heating the head up so that it's glowing red, and then welding it because it's made out of, it's cast iron. So it's welding cast iron for that application is an incredible skill. And I can't, racing in general and racing stock eliminator it's not a good idea to pay a whole lot of attention to what stuff costs, because it's really expensive. I think it was like $500 or $600 to get that head welded up, and then it all had to be completely remachined and everything after it was done. So that's the story of how I ended up replacing that head. And then eventually my engine guru guy, Dan Dvorak, got lucky and found a set of untouched, unrun, new old stock max wedge heads for my application at a swap meet, and I got those for I think I paid $3,500 for the pair, which it's a good deal for those. It's actually not a bad deal just in general. But so that's the story of my max wedge heads. Well, it's a good day to talk about Stock Eliminator because I'm printing shirts for my friend Jody Lang, who won the world championship in Stock Eliminator. That's his car there. As I've explained before, you win a championship in Stock Eliminator or Super Stock or any of the sportsman eliminators of NHRA by getting more points than anybody else in 3 national events and 5 divisional events. And Jody finally pulled that off this year. He's an awesome racer. He's a legend here in Division 6, the Northwest Division. He's been racing. As long as I've been racing, he's been out there. And he's a really awesome bracket racer. And I don't want to get ahead of over my skis. Bracket racing, for people who don't understand, who happen to still be watching this video after that Mopar head thing. Bracket racing is just what everybody does. It's like a weekend warrior type of thing. It's if you bring your car to the drag strip and you're racing, and you're not in some NHRA eliminator, you're probably bracket racing, which means everybody predicts how fast their car is going to run, and then they write that number in shoe polish on the window, and you try to get as close to that number as you can without beating it. And so, say my number is 10 seconds, and the guy in the other lane's number is 12 seconds. He'll leave 2 seconds before me, and so theoretically I'll catch up to him at the finish line. So it's a way of, some genius figured out in the 60s. This is a way so that everybody can compete against each other. And it's not just, it gets discouraging to only be whoever has the fastest car wins. I mean, I know that it makes for better television. Biggest engine on the street competition or whatever, but out in the real world here, not on the world of televised street racing, bracket racing allows everybody to compete with each other. And so that's kind of what a lot of stock eliminator racing is all the cars, they write what they think their car is going to run on the window, and then they try to get as close to that number as they can. You want to have a fast reaction time. You don't want to go too fast. That's a red light. And then, so anyways, that's bracket racing. And there's a lot of high dollar bracket racing, and that's what most people do when they go drag racing. And Stock Eliminator, guys. Stock Eliminator is like one of the oldest forms of drag racing there is. And basically, it's sometimes, I'm not snobby, but it can be a pretty snobby bunch of folks. And they don't like it when you call Stock Eliminator bracket racing. They are out there to make their combination the fastest it can be. And but unless you're up against somebody who's in the same class as you are, it's bracket racing. And that's why Jody Lang is such a badass, is because he, among other things, he's done a lot of bracket racing. And unless you're a good bracket racer, you're really not going to win a whole lot of you know, world championships in Stock Eliminator. Now, I'm not going to just drive everyone crazy and go off the deep end and how to blueprint your engine or anything like that. But the broad strokes of how to build a Stock Eliminator car are first, you have to figure out what kind of car you want to have, what your plan is. I tripped into this to the car I have because I'm a station wagon guy, and we happen to have a 1964 Plymouth that looked like it'd be a good candidate, and I was friends with Dan Dvorak, who's one of the original pioneers of max wedge racing, and so I just one step followed another, and before you know it, I'm building a max wedge stalker, which is I wouldn't necessarily recommend. There's a lot of heartbreak there. So there's the NHRA rule book, and that gives you the rules of what you're allowed to do and not do to your stalker. So you're not allowed to port your heads, like I said earlier. The cam has to be the same size as the stock cam. You have to run the same carburetors. The car has to weigh what it weighed from the factory. It has to have a full interior. The biggest tires you can run on are 9 by 30, so 9 inch wide, 30 inches tall. What other serious rules are there? They change the rules year by year. Now you're allowed to run a fuel cell instead of the stock gas tank. You used to have to run the stock gas tank. You're allowed to put light seats in now. You used to have to run the stock seat. When I first started racing in Stock Eliminator in 2005, some things that are different than now. I had a bench seat with it had a little hole so the submarine belt, so I could run the 5-point racing harness. You had to have a 5-point racing harness, but you were required to run seats that came from the factory. So I had a bench seat, and you were not required to wear a fireproof suit. All you had to wear was a helmet. So here I was in a 10-second race car in a t-shirt rolling on a bench seat, which I'm glad to say I did. Now I have to wear the full fireproof suit, and it's not the same as it used to be, but that was still pretty cool. And what other stuff I had to do there? It's picking the combination. Once you've picked the combination, then you have to take your car and make it as awesome as you can make it. You really, really go through it. Like Jody's wagon, this car has been a race car since I've known him. He's run other cars like this, and in fact, I learned how to drive in a car very similar to that back in 1980. I think that's what yours is. Anyways, you go through it, and you have to run the stock suspension, and everything has to be stock, but you take everything apart and make it as good as it can be. You pick, if there was some, classic example is like a 1964 Plymouth, they say it has to have the stock radiator in it. Well, they're not necessarily going to say, which stock radiator. So you can take the 1964 6-cylinder radiator and put it in instead of the 1964 426 truck radiator, which is what it came with, and no one's going to know the difference. Then you take a bunch of weight off the nose. You can, the leaf springs and the torsion bars and all the suspension pieces you can find the lightest stuff you can possibly get from the factory. And you push it, and sometimes they'll see something they don't like, and they'll tell you to fix it. Don't do that again. You know, a classic example of this is, you know, you get those batteries from the auto parts store that they put on the counter just to, you know, kind of like promotional, and they're not real batteries, they're just an empty plastic shell. And you know, if you ever worked in an auto parts store, you throw them at each other and it's like, some sort of battery. I mean, and then it's, you know, just a super light battery, but just the case. And in stock, you're allowed to run a battery in the trunk. You're allowed to run a battery in the trunk and nothing else if that's the way your car came. But most cars didn't come that way back then, and so you put a battery in the trunk that matches the battery up front, and that gives you two batteries, and there's advantages to that. And so people would put one of those lightweight empty batteries up front and a real battery in the back, and then somebody catches on, and then you get, what are they called? Oh, you get a vacation for 6 months. Like the NHRA says, oh, bad, and so then you have to not race for 6 months because they caught you with an empty battery in the front of your car, or whatever particular cheating stuff is. And, you know, nobody likes to be called a cheater, but you know, stock Eliminator or NASCAR stock, or maybe just racing in general, is you know, figuring out where the rules are ambiguous, where the rules can be pushed, and that's what makes it interesting. And in fact, you know, just as a general 30,000 foot view of stock eliminator racing or super stock, the thing that I think draws a lot of people to it is it's an intellectual exercise. I mean, drag racing in general, if you really get into it and do it and figure out what the rules are and what people are up against, it's already kind of an intellectual exercise. But when you go take it to stock eliminator and you're trying to blueprint your combination to be the fastest it can be, it involves a lot of thinking, and you know, there's some interesting payoffs to it. I mean, it's a very scientific endeavor. You know, a perfect example of this is when I started racing stock eliminator, we helped put this car together, which has now gone through a couple of my friends, which was a 71 or 72 Comet. It's probably more familiar as a Maverick. It's the Mercury version of the Maverick, and he had put a 302 two-barrel in it, which is, you know, not a legendary performance engine by any stretch of the imagination, but it the NHRA, the governing body, had never really looked at that engine and decided how much horsepower it was worth. They just kind of took the factory's word for it, and so as a result, it was very under-factored, which means it makes a lot more horsepower than the NHRA thinks. So then that immediately gives you a advantage from the beginning. So then you don't have to do every trick in the book to make your car competitive. So it's so hard to explain stock eliminator. I find myself kind of getting ahead of myself when I try to explain it to people. Competitive. There's something in stock eliminator called the index. And the index is the minimum speed your car can go, the minimum time. So my index for my car is 1140. So my car has to go. If I go and I dial in, you know, I'm bracket racing and put the number on my windshield at a race, it cannot be any slower than 1140. So I want my car to be able to go faster than 1140, otherwise it's really not competitive. You've got to be able to go with the number that you've written on your windshield. Plus, when you're qualifying to race, like before the actual eliminator before you're racing to stay in the race. You have to qualify. So everybody goes and races, and like say I go out and I run a 10.80. So that puts me at 0.6 underneath my index. My index is 11.4 and I go 10.8, so it's 0.6 under my index. On any given day, that will qualify me pretty much right in the middle of the pack. So say there's some rich guy with a brand new Kobo Camaro, and he's a AA stocker, and his index is I can't remember what the AA stocker index is, but say call it 10 flat, and then he runs a 9.0. That would mean he gets he'd be 1 second under the index, and then maybe he'd be number one qualifier. So the how far under your index affects where you qualify, and then so you got this big list of all the qualifiers, and that determines who races against who at a race. So like generally the list will be number one qualifier will go against the guy right at the top of the second half of the pack, and then number two will go against number two, number three against number three, etc. There's all kinds of little cheater guides where it tells you how to figure out who you're going to be up against. And when you're qualifying, they usually give you a couple of shots, and people like Jody Lang here, and I want to try to be like Jody Lang, which is always a good idea if you want to win races. Do what Jody does. You qualify slow because you can move up, but you can't move down. So if you qualify at a second under the index, you can't then qualify 0.6 under the index. It's always going to be your best time determines where you are on the qualifying sheet. And so when you have in mind who you might be up against, then you can decide whether you want to go faster. You can't go slower. So you qualify slow, and then you see what the list is doing, and you can tell who you're going to be up against. And this is important because if you're, like my car is a C stocker, I usually want to avoid other C stockers because most cars are faster than my old station wagon in C. I mean, my car is a fast car, but when you put me on in the Stock Eliminator race and I'm up against other C cars, a lot of them are, big block Mustangs and Camaros and combinations that are potentially more competitive than mine. Any given year my car could be pretty competitive, but it's just I just want to avoid running against people who are going to be a heads-up class because two C stockers run against each other. Nobody writes on their window. It's just whoever gets to the finish line first, and I want to avoid that. So when I'm qualifying, I like to leave something in my pocket. Qualify slow, and then see what's going on, and then I can go faster if I need to. Okay, so Stock Eliminator, picking the car is important. Getting the rules. You're picking the combination. Like this car, the one I'm printing right now, Jody's car, is typically powered by a 305 cubic inch Chevy small block V8. Which doesn't have the best of reputations. No one ever says, I'm going to street race my 305 Chevy small block. But that's not to say it doesn't have lots of potential. If you know what you're doing, which means if you work hard and spend your money on the right engine builder, basically, you can really make a 305 fly. Especially when it comes, it's how fast it goes is all relative to how fast NHRA thinks it should go. And so typically some super rich guy, Jody, basically he makes his bones by being a really good racer. He's not like a huge money spender. I mean, he spends what he has to spend, I'm assuming, but there are people out there who go to their badass engine builder. There's a few of them out there and say, I don't care what it costs. I want to have the fastest 305 or 302 or 426 or whatever in the country. And, cost is no object. And so those guys are out there. But in general, like back to the intellectual thing, we're trying to figure out the best combinations, have the least. They talk about with the NHRA, if they decide that I'm going too fast with my car, like if I qualify more than a second under my index, that somebody in Glendora, where the NHRA headquarters is, they will say, Gaffo is going more than a second under the index all the time with his max wedge combination. What should we do about this? And usually what they'll do is they'll look at other combinations like mine around the country and say, look at that. Well, Joe on the East Coast is going under a second under all the time too. And so they'll decide to throw some more horsepower on my combination. And what that means, like the high compression max wedge combination that I typically run has 420. It's rated at 425 horsepower. So if they up the horsepower, if they say, okay, we're going to say you're worth 430 horsepower now instead of 425, that means that they will, if they add 5 horsepower, or let's call it 10 just to be simple, 435. If they add 10 horsepower to my combination, then that means my car has to weigh more, because the way they determine how much your car weighs is the horsepower is multiplied times the factor of your class. So my factor is 9 because I'm a C stocker. If I was A stock, it'd be 8.5. If I was D stock, it'd be 9.5. So 9 is my factor for C. So if they rate me at an extra 10 horsepower, I have to add 9 times 10, 90 pounds to my car. And 90 pounds in general, in any race car, any drag car, will make your car pretty much 1/10 slower. So that's how they slow you down. And basically that works. I mean, it's nothing's perfect. And like if you're the rich guy out there who says I want to have the fastest 305 in the country, typically what you'll do is you'll figure out some way to put your car into bracket mode, which means you're not going as fast as you possibly can, because even as a rich guy, you don't want to have like the NHRA constantly throwing weight on your car. I mean, there's lots of examples in the history of Stock Eliminator where a combination has been run so fast, so often, that it's no longer competitive. Like if you want to put your certain combinations would have to weigh like 5,500 pounds or something, something you just couldn't do. And so that's another intellectual part of Stock Eliminator racing. You can see you can run around in circles. I mean, it literally keeps people awake at night thinking about how to do this kind of stuff. So the thing I like the most about Stock Eliminator drag racing, and not just drag racing, sport in general, the sport of Stock Eliminator racing compared to any other sport, is that you get to meet the heroes of the sport and potentially kick their ass because they're going to be in the other lane. Like the whole boasting thing drives me crazy, and I'm just not going to do it. But I will say, I have competed against icons of the sport and beat them, like at national events in front of 70,000 people. You go up against some guy who you've been reading about in the magazines since you're a little kid, and holy shit, I just beat that guy. And there's no, you know, and you can shake their hands and sign my dashboard. Ooh, you're the greatest. Better luck next time. And, you know, there's just no substitute for that. I mean, what would you compare it to? Like, you know, you couldn't do that in a football game. You know, maybe you might be able to, you know, catch some old baseball player at a softball tournament or something like that. Maybe that's comparable. But it's a hoot. And, you know, and not just setting aside, you know, who you beat or don't beat. I just love being at national events and racing in front of thousands and thousands of people. I mean, I like racing at bracket races too. Don't get me wrong. That is where I started. And you can't be. It keeps you sharp as a stock eliminator racer to bracket race as much as you possibly can. I mean, there's a lot of superheroes of stock eliminator who are, you're going to see them at their local track whenever they can racing. And but there's not going to be 70,000 people in the seats. There's not even going to be 70,000 seats. If you're going to go to a national event and race stock eliminator, if you are successful enough to still be there on Sunday, they put you in between all the John Force eliminators, you know, all of those badass top fuel dragsters and funny cars and all of them. They run the final rounds of stock and super street and all that. They're all racing too. So there's still butts in the stands. And stock eliminator racing and super stock to a slightly lesser degree, there's people, that's all they're interested in. They come out to the races to watch that, which is pretty cool. And I watch those street outlaw type shows, and you know, I want to hate them, I do, but I get caught up in it a little bit, and I just wish, you know, and I'm going to be the guy to do this, but maybe somebody out there watching will be able to do this. I just wish that somebody could put the same attention into stock eliminator racing, because you know, when I race it, I've gotten to know a lot of people, and you know, they've all got interesting stories, and you know, like you're making your combination work, and there's lots of 69 Camaros and new Dodge Challengers and you know, Super Cobra Jet Mustangs and stuff, but there's also a lot of, like, you know, I got a friend who runs a AMC Pacer wagon, and I know people who run 4-doors, and of course, you know, I'm wagons of steel, so I know most of the guys out west, at least, who run station wagons, and you know, it's just interesting, like a little personality thing. So maybe somebody will make a show about NHRA Stock Eliminator racing. You know, there used to be IHRA Stock Eliminator racing too. NHRA is National Hot Rod Association, and IHRA, I guess, is International Hot Rod Association. They're like a competing governing body, and they just got rid of stock and super stock. They just got tired of the rules and figuring it out, and so no, hopefully they won't do the same thing with NHRA, but you know, we got to enjoy it while it's there. So if you have a chance, come on out and see some NHRA stock and super stock racing. It's fun, and you know, most of the people in the class, they like to talk about their combinations or what they're doing. You don't want to bug them when they're getting their game on or anything, but you know, the thing about drag racing is you can really get right up to the trailers and right up to the operations and see what's going on, and you know, meet the people. And you know, I highly recommend come on out and check it out sometime. And if you're in the Northwest, get in contact with Wagons of Steel, and we'll show you a good time. Well, I guess that's it for this week. Can't think of anything else really to tell you about stock and super stock. If you have any requests, let me know. Next time I'm going to try and do a video about how Wagons of Steel makes the Wagons of Steel calendar, which is it'll be a real change of pace from this. It's a do-it-yourself project, and it'll be an eye-opener for everyone. And you know, since it doesn't seem to be making itself this year, I guess I'm going to have to get to work on it. So I'll have something to show you next week with that. In the meantime, take care.